She posted the photo before I ever saw the balance. A glass of champagne held up against a blue sky that didn't belong to my life. And in that moment I knew something was wrong before I even opened my bank app. I remember the way the kitchen felt that morning. Quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful, just still, like the house itself was waiting for me to notice. The coffee I'd poured sitting untouched beside me as I stared at her smiling face on my phone. Vanessa in a white linen dress, sunglasses too large for her face, standing on a terrace overlooking the ocean somewhere far from Ohio. And I thought at first that maybe Daniel had surprised her, that maybe they'd finally taken a trip they'd been talking about for years. But then I noticed the caption, "Finally doing what we deserve." And something about that word deserve settled in my chest like a stone. I opened my banking app slowly, not because I expected anything, but because a small, quiet instinct told me I should. And when the numbers loaded, I blinked once, then twice, thinking maybe I'd tapped the wrong account because the balance didn't look like mine anymore. It looked like a mistake, like someone else's account, one that had been drained down to something small and fragile. And I remember touching the screen with my finger as if that might change it, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something familiar if I just waited long enough. They didn't. They stayed exactly where they were, and I scrolled down through the transactions, each one more precise than the last. Airline tickets, first class, a resort I'd never heard of but could picture perfectly from the photo she'd posted, spa packages, private tours, dinners that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. And I felt something inside me go very still, not broken, not shattered, just quiet, like a door closing somewhere deep inside that I hadn't realized was still open. I didn't call her, I didn't call Daniel, I didn't even say her name out loud. I just sat there at my kitchen table, the same one I'd paid off 20 years ago, the same one where I used to help Daniel with his homework, where I'd balanced every checkbook, every bill, every careful decision that had built that savings account dollar by dollar. And I let the silence stretch because for the first time, I understood that this wasn't an accident, this wasn't confusion, this was a choice someone had made about my life without asking me. And I needed to see it clearly before I said a single word. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second marking the space between who I thought my family was and who they had quietly become. And I found myself thinking back to the day Vanessa had offered to help me with online banking, how patient she'd sounded, how reassuring, how she'd said it was just easier this way, safer, and I had believed her, not because I was naive, but because I trusted that the people sitting at my table wouldn't take something that wasn't theirs. And now here I was, looking at the proof that trust had been turned into access, and access had been turned into something else entirely. I picked up my coffee then, took a sip, and it had gone cold, but I didn't make a new cup. I just set it back down and kept reading through the transactions, memorizing them not out of anger, but out of a need to understand exactly what had been done, because if there was one thing I had learned in 68 years, it was that clarity mattered more than emotion, that you couldn't fix what you refused to see, and I wasn't going to look away from this, not anymore. Outside, a car passed by slowly, tires against pavement. Ordinary life continuing just as it always did, and I sat there in my quiet kitchen holding my phone in one hand, the truth in the other, and I realized that whatever happened next wasn't going to be loud, it wasn't going to be dramatic, it was going to be something else entirely, something quieter, something final. And for the first time since I'd seen that photo, I felt steady again, not because the situation had changed, but because I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew just as clearly what I was going to do about it. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was upset in the way people expect, but because my mind had begun to arrange things quietly, carefully, like it used to when Daniel was young and I had to stretch a paycheck across groceries, school supplies, and a mortgage that never seemed to shrink fast enough. And I realized as I lay there staring at the ceiling that this feeling was not new, it was familiar. The same calm focus that comes when something needs to be handled and there is no one else left to handle it. The next morning, the house looked exactly the same. Sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the same pale yellow walls, the same wooden cabinets I had refinished myself 10 years ago. But something in me had shifted, and I moved through the space differently, slower, more deliberate, as if I were seeing it all for the first time and deciding what still belonged to me and what did not. I made breakfast out of habit, 2 eggs, 1 slice of toast, black coffee, and I sat at the table again, this time with a notebook beside me, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted everything written down, every date, every amount, every detail, and I copied the transactions from my phone onto the page in careful handwriting, the way I used to balance my checkbook at the end of every month, because there is a kind of clarity that comes from seeing things laid out in ink that a screen does not quite give you. As I wrote, I began to notice the pattern, not just the spending but the timing, the way the charges lined up over several days, how they started small and then grew larger, more confident, as if whoever was making them had realized no one was going to stop them. And I paused there, pen resting against the paper, because that was the part that mattered, not just that the money was gone, but that it had been taken with the expectation that I would not notice or that I would not act. And I thought about the last few months, the way Vanessa had been stopping by more often, the way she had insisted on helping me set up automatic payments, how she had said, "You should not have to worry about these things at your age," and I had nodded, not because I felt incapable, but because it had seemed kind, and kindness is something you do not question when it comes from family, at least not until it gives you a reason to. I finished writing everything down, closed the notebook and set it aside. Then I opened my phone again and looked at her photos, not with confusion this time, but with a kind of detached attention, noticing details I had missed before: the brand of the handbag, the view from the balcony, the way she angled the camera to capture as much of the room as possible. And I understood that this was not just a vacation, it was a display, a statement, something meant to be seen. And that made it clearer than anything else that this had not been a misunderstanding, it had been intentional. Around mid-morning my phone rang, and for a moment I thought it might be Daniel. But it was not. It was the bank, a woman named Karen whose voice I recognized from years of polite conversations about interest rates and account updates, and she asked if I had a moment to review some recent activity. And I told her yes, I did, and I listened as she read through the same transactions I had already written down, her tone careful, professional, as if she were waiting for me to say that everything was authorized, that there had been no mistake. And when she finished, there was a brief silence on the line before she asked, very gently, whether I had made those purchases myself, and I said no, I had not, and I could hear the shift in her voice immediately, the quiet tightening of procedure, the beginning of something official. And she explained the steps we could take, the reports that could be filed, the protections that could be put in place. But I found myself interrupting her, not abruptly, just enough to say that I understood, that I appreciated her calling, and that I would be handling things on my end first, because there were some matters that could not be resolved by forms or claims, matters that required something else entirely. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment longer, the phone still in my hand, and I realized that I was not shaking, not even a little, which surprised me more than anything else, because I had expected anger, or at least some kind of visible reaction. But what I felt instead was a steady, quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself. And I stood up, walked to the sink, rinsed my coffee cup, and set it in the drying rack, the same small routine I had followed for years. And as I dried my hands on a clean towel, I made a decision that did not feel sudden or dramatic, but inevitable, like something that had been waiting for me to arrive at it. And I knew that whatever came next would not be about recovering what had been taken, it would be about deciding who, from this moment forward, would no longer have access to any part of my life. I did not call them that day, or the day after, and that was the first thing that would have seemed strange to anyone who knew me before, because I had always been the one to fix things quickly, to smooth over misunderstandings before they had time to grow. But this was not something that needed smoothing, it was something that needed to be seen in full, and I wanted them to walk into that moment without warning, without the chance to prepare a story or soften the edges of what had already been done. Instead, I spent those days putting small things in order, the kind of quiet adjustments that no one notices until they try to rely on what used to be there. I changed my passwords, every single one, not rushed, not panicked, just methodical, writing them down in a new notebook that would stay in a drawer no one else had access to. I removed secondary users from my accounts, canceled the shared credit card I had once added for emergencies, and updated my contact information so that every alert, every confirmation, every question came directly to me and no one else. It was not dramatic work, but it was steady, and with each step I felt something returning to me that I had not realized I had been slowly giving away. Not just control over my finances, but control over the boundaries of my own life. On the third morning I called Daniel, not to confront him, not yet, but to invite him and Vanessa to dinner that Sunday, the same way I had done for years, my voice calm, almost routine, and he sounded relieved, which told me more than any explanation could have. He said they had just gotten back from their trip, that they had brought me something, a small laugh in his voice as if this were all still part of something normal. And I told him that sounded lovely, that I would see them at 5 o'clock, and when I hung up I did not feel anger, I felt clarity. The rest of the week unfolded in a way that might have looked ordinary from the outside. I went to the grocery store, pushing my cart slowly down the same aisles. I had walked for decades, choosing fresh vegetables, a good cut of meat, a bottle of wine that Daniel used to like before his taste became more expensive. And as I placed each item in the cart, I found myself remembering small things, the way he used to ask for seconds when he was a teenager, the way he would sit at this very table and tell me about his day, and I let those memories come and go without holding on to them, because they belonged to a different version of him, and perhaps a different version of me as well. Back at home, I prepared the house the way I always did for Sunday dinner. I set the table with my best dishes, the ones I only used for family, polished the silverware until it caught the light just right, and folded the napkins neatly beside each plate. There was a rhythm to it, a familiarity that might have felt comforting once, but now it felt like I was completing something, not beginning it, like I was closing a chapter with the same care I had once used to build it. On Saturday afternoon, I took out the notebook again and reviewed everything one more time, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because I wanted to be certain of my footing. I wanted no hesitation, no uncertainty when the moment came, and as I turned each page, I noticed something I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge before, that this had not happened overnight, that there had been small permissions granted along the way, small moments where I had stepped back and allowed someone else to step in, thinking it was temporary, thinking it was helpful, and I did not blame myself for that, but I did recognize it, and that recognition felt important. Sunday arrived quietly the way all Sundays do, and by 4:30 the house smelled of roasted chicken and herbs. The table was set, the wine was breathing on the counter, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking around at everything I had prepared, and I realized that this would be the last time I did this for them in this way, not because I could not, but because I would not, and there was a difference between those two things that I had only just begun to understand. At exactly 5 o'clock, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine shutting off, doors closing, footsteps approaching the front porch, and I wiped my hands on a clean towel, walked to the door, and opened it with the same composed expression I had practiced for years, ready to welcome them in, not as the woman they thought they knew, but as someone who had already made her decision long before they stepped across the threshold. Vanessa walked in first, carrying a large shopping bag with glossy handles, her smile wide and polished, the kind she wore when she wanted to be admired, and Daniel followed behind her, a step slower, his eyes scanning the room the way they used to when he was trying to read my mood before saying anything. And I stepped aside to let them in, my hand resting lightly on the door as it closed behind them, sealing the quiet space we were about to share. The house seemed to absorb their presence. Without changing, the same soft light, the same familiar smell of dinner, and Vanessa looked around as if she were seeing it through a different lens now, not as a home but as something smaller, something less impressive than the places she had just come back from, and she held out the bag toward me with a small laugh, saying she had brought me something from the trip, something special, and I took it, thanked her, and set it gently on the counter without opening it, because whatever was inside that bag had already lost its meaning before it reached my hands. We moved to the dining room, the chairs sliding softly against the floor as we sat down, and for a few minutes everything unfolded exactly as it always had, the passing of dishes, the polite questions about the week, the easy rhythm of conversation that had once felt natural, but now felt like something being performed, and I watched them as they spoke, noticing the way Vanessa leaned forward when she talked about the resort, how she described the view, the service, the way everything had been perfect, and Daniel nodded along, adding small details, his tone careful, as if he were trying to keep everything light, to keep it from tipping into something else. I did not interrupt, I did not question, I simply listened, cutting my food into small, even pieces, taking slow bites, letting them fill the silence with their version of events, and there was a moment, brief but clear, when Vanessa mentioned how easy it had been to book everything, how she had found the best deals because she knew where to look, and she smiled as she said it, a quick glance in my direction that passed just as quickly, but it was enough to confirm that she knew exactly what she had done and how she had done it. Dinner continued, the plates gradually emptying, the conversation thinning out as it always does toward the end of a meal, and when I stood up to clear the table, Daniel moved as if to help, but I shook my head slightly, telling him to stay seated, that I had it, and I carried the dishes into the kitchen one by one, placing them in the sink with quiet care, rinsing each plate before setting it aside, taking just enough time to let the moment settle into place, because what came next was not something that could be rushed. When I returned to the dining room, I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I walked to the sideboard and picked up the folder I had prepared earlier. A simple manila folder, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention on its own, and I brought it back to the table, placing it in front of Vanessa with the same steady movement I had used to set down every other item that evening. And For a second no one spoke, the air shifting in a way that was subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm you can feel but not yet see. Daniel looked at the folder, then at me, his expression tightening just slightly, and Vanessa's smile faltered for the first time since she had walked through the door, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table as if she were deciding whether to reach for it or pull away. And I finally took my seat, folding my hands in front of me, meeting her eyes with a calm that surprised even me. And I said her name once, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly. And then I said that before we talked about anything else, there was something I needed her to explain, and I watched as the color in her face shifted, just enough to be noticed if you were paying attention. And in that quiet space between us, with the folder still unopened on the table, I knew that whatever she chose to say next would not change what I had already decided, but it would reveal exactly who she believed I was, and whether she thought I would accept it. Vanessa did not reach for the folder right away, which told me more than if she had opened it immediately, because hesitation like that does not come from confusion, it comes from recognition, and I watched as her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table before she finally slid the folder toward herself, her movements slower now, more careful, as if she could control what was inside by delaying the moment she had to see it. Daniel shifted in his chair, the sound of the wood against the floor sharper in the quiet room, and he glanced between us, his expression caught somewhere between concern and avoidance, the way it had been all evening, and I realized then that whatever he knew or thought he knew, it had not been enough to make him ask questions before this moment, and that realization settled into me with a kind of clarity that did not need to be spoken. Vanessa opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page, then the next, the neat lines of transactions, dates, and amounts laid out in a way that left no room for interpretation, and for a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft turning of paper, until she stopped, her hand resting flat against the page as if to steady herself, and she let out a small breath that might have passed as a laugh if it had not been so thin. She looked up at me then, her smile returning, but not quite as smooth as before, and she said there must have been some kind of misunderstanding, that maybe the bank had made an error, that she had only helped me set things up, nothing more, and her voice carried that same practiced warmth I had heard so many times before, the tone that suggested reason, reassurance, something easy to accept if you wanted to believe it. I did not interrupt her, I let her finish, because sometimes the way a person explains something tells you more than the explanation itself, and when she was done I reached forward and turned the folder slightly, pointing to a specific line, the one that listed the airline tickets, first class, round trip, purchased on a date that matched exactly with the photo she had posted, and I asked her very simply if the bank had also made that mistake, and for the first time, the silence that followed did not belong to me, it belonged to her. Daniel leaned forward then, his brow furrowed, his eyes moving over the page as if he were seeing it for the first time, and he said Vanessa's name in a way that was almost a question, almost a warning, but not quite either, and she turned to him quickly, her voice rising just slightly as she said it was not what it looked like, that she had planned to tell me, that she was going to replace the money before I even noticed, and I watched the way she spoke, the speed of it, the way the words came one after another without space, as if she believed that if she kept talking, the truth would not have time to settle. I sat back in my chair, my hands still folded in front of me, and I let her speak until she ran out of explanations, until the room grew quiet again, and then I asked her one more question, not about the money, not about the transactions, but about something else entirely. I asked her when she had decided that what was mine was something she could use without asking, and that question seemed to land differently, not as something she could explain away, but as something she had to face, and she looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a brief moment the confidence slipped, replaced by something sharper, something closer to irritation than guilt, and she said that I was not using the money anyway, that it was just sitting there, that she and Daniel had bills, plans, a future to build, and that I had always said I wanted to help, and there it was, not hidden anymore, not softened but clear and direct, the belief underneath everything else. Daniel's expression changed at that, his eyes moving from her to me, and I could see the moment he understood that this was not just a mistake, not just a misunderstanding, but something that had been justified in her mind long before it ever happened, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out, and I did not look at him because what I needed to hear had already been said, and I realized then that the most important part of this conversation was not what they had taken, but how easily they had decided it was theirs to take, and in that understanding everything else became very simple. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice lacked the certainty it used to carry, the kind that once filled a room when he was a young man explaining plans and ideas with confidence, and now it sounded thinner, like something stretched too far, as he said that maybe this could be fixed, that maybe there was a way to sort it out without making it into something bigger than it already was, and I turned my eyes toward him for the first time since the folder had been opened, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a quiet recognition that the boy I had raised and the man sitting across from me were no longer the same person, and perhaps had not been for some time. Vanessa leaned back in her chair then, her expression settling into something more defensive, less polished, and she crossed her arms lightly as if to create a boundary of her own, saying that she had every intention of paying it back, that it was not like the money was gone forever, that it had simply been used, and the way she said used lingered in the air, as if that word alone could soften what had actually happened. And I let that word sit there for a moment before I responded, because sometimes it is important to let people hear what they have just said. I told her that money is not something that simply gets used when it belongs to someone else, that it is something that is entrusted, protected, and respected, and I spoke calmly, not raising my voice, not emphasizing any single word more than another, because I was not trying to convince her. I was simply stating something that did not require agreement. To be true. Daniel rubbed his hands together then, a small gesture I recognized from years ago when he was nervous about something he could not fix, and he said that they could make a plan, that they could pay me back over time, that there was no need to make any sudden decisions, and I listened to him carefully because this was the part that mattered, not the money itself but the way they both approached what had been done, as something negotiable, something that could be rearranged into a more comfortable shape if we all just agreed to it. I shook my head slightly, not in refusal of him but in acknowledgement of what he was offering, and I told him that this was not about repayment, not anymore, that what had happened had already moved beyond numbers and timelines, and as I said that, I could see confusion flicker across his face because he was still trying to place this within a framework he understood, something that could be solved, adjusted, balanced out, and I realized then that he had not yet understood the full weight of what had been lost. Vanessa exhaled sharply, her patience thinning, and she said that I was overreacting, that it was just money, that families help each other all the time, and there it was again, that same belief stated more plainly now, and I met her gaze without flinching, because there was no longer anything left to avoid, and I told her that help is something you ask for, not something you take, and that the difference between those two things is what defines whether something is given or taken, and she held my gaze for a second longer before looking away, her jaw tightening just slightly. The room felt different then, not tense in a loud way but settled, as if everything that needed to surface had already done so, and I placed my hands flat against the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath my palms, grounding myself in the present moment, because what I was about to say next was not something I had decided in anger, but something I had understood in stillness. I told them that I had already secured my accounts, that no one else had access to them anymore, that any shared financial arrangements we had in place were now closed, and I spoke each sentence slowly, clearly, not to make a point, but to ensure there was no misunderstanding, and Daniel's eyes widened slightly as he processed what that meant, not just for the situation at hand, but for everything that had quietly depended on those arrangements before. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to respond, but I raised my hand just slightly, not to silence her, but to indicate that I was not finished, and I continued, telling them that from this moment forward, there would be a different understanding between us, one that did not include access to my finances, my accounts, or any decisions related to them, and I paused there, letting the words settle fully before adding the part that mattered most, that trust, once broken in this way, is not something that can be restored through explanations or promises, but only through time and distance, and for now, distance was the only thing I was willing to offer. Daniel leaned back slowly, the weight of what I had said beginning to register, and Vanessa's expression hardened in a way that no longer tried to hide itself, but I did not react to either of them, because my decision had already been made long before this conversation began, and now all that remained was to let them understand that what had changed could not be undone simply because they wished it had not happened. For a moment no one moved, as if the room itself had drawn a line that neither of them quite knew how to cross, and I could see Daniel trying to find something to say that would bring us back to what he still believed was possible. A version of this conversation where everything softened, where time would blur the edges and we would all return to the same table next Sunday as if nothing had changed, but that version no longer existed, and the sooner he understood that, the kinder it would be in the long run. Vanessa was the first to break the silence, her chair shifting slightly as she leaned forward again, her voice sharper now, less controlled, as she said that cutting them off like this was extreme, that families go through things, that people make mistakes, and the word mistake hung there in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if repeating it enough times might reshape what had already been done. And I listened to her, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to understand exactly how she saw the situation, and more importantly, how she saw me. I noticed the way she avoided certain words, the way she circled around the idea without ever naming it directly, and I realized that for her, this was still a negotiation, still something that could be adjusted if she found the right angle, the right explanation, and that realization made something very clear to me, that if I left even the smallest opening, she would take it, not out of malice in the way people often imagine, but out of a belief that she was entitled to it. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time, and he said my name the way he used to when he needed me to understand something important, but there was hesitation in it now, uncertainty, and he said that they had not meant to hurt me, that things had gotten out of hand, that they would fix it, and I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw not a man trying to deceive me, but a man trying to avoid the full weight of what had happened, because facing it would require him to choose a side, and he was not ready to do that. I told him, gently but without hesitation, that intention does not undo action, that saying you did not mean to hurt someone does not erase the fact that you did. And I watched as that settled over him, not as something he could argue with, but as something he had to absorb. Vanessa exhaled again, louder this time, and she said that I was making this into something bigger than it needed to be, that it was just money, that I still had my house, my life, that nothing had really been taken from me that I could not recover. And I let her finish because those words mattered not for their accuracy but for what they revealed, and when she was done I leaned forward slightly, just enough to meet her at the same level, and I told her that what had been taken was not measured in dollars, that it was measured in trust, in respect, in the understanding that family does not treat each other as a resource to be used without consent, and I spoke calmly, each word placed carefully, because this was not about persuading her, it was about stating something that did not require her agreement to be true. Daniel looked between us again, his expression tightening as the space between what he wanted and what was actually happening grew wider, and I could see the moment he realized that this was not going to resolve itself the way he had hoped, that there would not be a simple path back to normal, and he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times before, but this time it carried something heavier, something closer to resignation than frustration. I sat back then, allowing the silence to return, not as a pause but as a conclusion, and I told them that this conversation was not about reaching an agreement, that it was about understanding what had already been decided, and that decision was not open for discussion, and I let that settle fully before I added that moving forward, our relationship would change in ways that might take time for them to understand, but that time would not alter the boundaries I had set. Vanessa shook her head slightly, as if she could not quite accept what she was hearing, and Daniel looked down at the table, his hands resting there without movement, and in that moment I felt something I had not expected, not relief, not satisfaction, but a quiet sense of completion, as if a chapter that had been slowly unraveling had finally reached its end, and there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to explain, only the simple reality that from this point forward, the life I had built would no longer include the assumptions they had made about it, and that was not something I needed them to agree with, only something they needed to live with. No one spoke for several seconds after that, and I let the silence remain exactly where it was because silence, when it is allowed to exist, has a way of settling truth into places that words cannot reach, and I could see it happening in real time, the way Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, the way Vanessa's posture stiffened as if she were holding herself together against something she could not quite push back anymore. I stood up then, not abruptly, not in a way that would break the calm I had maintained throughout the evening, but with the same steady intention I had carried since the moment I first saw that empty balance, and I began to gather the remaining dishes from the table, one by one, moving between the dining room and the kitchen with quiet efficiency, and neither of them followed this time, neither of them offered to help, which in its own way felt like an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted, that this was no longer the kind of evening where roles were shared and softened. In the kitchen, I rinsed each plate under warm water, the familiar sound grounding me, the simple routine of it reminding me that there are parts of life that remain steady no matter what changes around them, and as I set each dish into the rack, I felt a growing sense of order returning, not just to the space but to myself, as if I were placing things back where they belonged, even if what belonged no longer included the same people it once did. When I returned to the dining room, they were still seated, Daniel looking down at his hands, Vanessa staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable now, and I paused for a moment, taking in the scene, understanding that this would be one of those moments that stays with you, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood. I told them that it was getting late, that I would not be continuing the conversation tonight, and my voice remained even, not dismissive, not cold, just final, and Daniel looked up quickly, as if he wanted to say something more, to reach for something that might still be salvaged, but the words did not come, and I could see that he was beginning to realize that there are situations where there is no immediate solution, only consequences that unfold over time. Vanessa stood up then, her movements sharper than before, and she picked up her bag from the chair beside her, holding it close as if it were something she needed to keep between herself and the room, and she said that she still believed this could be worked out, that I would come around once I had time to think about it, and I did not argue with her, because belief is something people hold on to until they are forced to let it go, and I had no intention of doing that work for her. I walked them to the door, the same way I had done countless times before, the hallway light casting a soft glow along the walls, the familiar creak of the floorboards under our steps, and when I opened the door, the evening air moved in gently, cool and quiet, and for a brief moment everything felt almost normal again, like the ending of any ordinary visit. But that feeling passed quickly, replaced by something clearer, something more grounded in reality. Daniel lingered for a second, his hand resting against the doorframe, and he looked at me in a way that carried more questions than words, and I met his gaze, not with reassurance but with honesty, and I told him that I loved him, because that had not changed, but that love does not erase what has been done, and it does not remove the need for boundaries, and he nodded slowly, as if he understood at least part of that, even if the rest would take time. Vanessa said nothing else, her expression closed now, and she stepped out onto the porch, Daniel following a moment later, and I watched as they walked down the path to the driveway, the sound of their footsteps fading into the quiet of the evening, the car door opening and closing, the engine starting, and then they were gone. I stood there for a moment. Longer after the car pulled away, the door still open, the night air cool against my skin, and I realized that what I felt was not emptiness, not loss in the way I might have expected, but something steadier, something closer to clarity, as if the uncertainty that had been lingering beneath the surface for months had finally been brought into the light and resolved, not by fixing it, but by seeing it for what it was. I closed the door gently, turned the lock, and stood in the quiet house, listening to the absence of their voices, the absence of their presence, and for the first time since this began, I understood that what I had done was not an ending in the way people often fear, but a beginning of something else entirely, something that belonged to me alone, defined not by what others expected to take but by what I chose to keep. The house stayed quiet long after they left, not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that settles in gently, as if everything has finally returned to its proper place, and I moved through it slowly, turning off the lights one by one, straightening the chairs at the table, folding the napkins that had been used and setting them aside for the morning, small tasks that did not need to be done immediately but felt right to complete, because there is a certain comfort in finishing what has been started, especially when something much larger has just come to an end. I made myself another cup of coffee even though it was late, the familiar smell filling the kitchen as I stood by the counter, not rushing, not thinking ahead, just allowing the moment to exist as it was. And when I carried the cup back to the table and sat down, I did not reach for my phone, I did not check the balance again, because I no longer needed to. The numbers had already served their purpose, they had shown me what I needed to see, and now it was time to move forward from that understanding. Over the next few days I continued to make changes not out of fear but out of intention. I met with my bank in person, sat across from a woman who listened carefully as I explained what had happened, and together we reviewed every account, every setting, every layer of protection that could be put in place. And I made sure that everything was exactly as it should be, not just secure but clear, with no shared access, no assumptions left unspoken. And when I left the bank I felt lighter, not because anything had been undone, but because everything was now fully within my control again. I also met with an attorney, someone I had not needed to see in years, and we went over my will, my accounts, the way my assets were structured, and I made adjustments where they were needed, not out of anger but out of clarity, because decisions like these should never be made in the heat of a moment. They should be made in a state of understanding, and I wanted everything to reflect exactly what I now knew to be true about the people in my life. Daniel called a few times during that week, his voice quieter each time, less certain, and I answered him, not avoiding him, but also not offering the reassurance he might have been hoping for, and our conversations were brief, careful, as if we were both learning how to speak to each other again in a way that acknowledged what had changed, and I did not ask about Vanessa, and he did not mention her, and that silence between us felt more honest than any explanation would have been. I spent more time on my own than I had in a long while, not because I had lost something, but because I had reclaimed something, the ability to exist without constantly adjusting myself to accommodate others, and I found small things that brought me a quiet sense of satisfaction, walking through my neighborhood in the early morning, organizing drawers that had been cluttered for years, sitting by the window in the afternoon with a book I could read at my own pace, without interruption, without obligation. There were moments, of course, when memories surfaced, moments from years ago when everything felt simpler, when trust had not been something I needed to question, and I allowed those memories to pass through me without holding on to them, because they belonged to a different time, a different understanding, and I no longer needed them to define what came next. One evening, about a week after that dinner, I opened the cabinet where I had placed the gift Vanessa had brought, still unopened, and I took it out, set it on the counter, and looked at it for a moment, considering what it represented, not the object inside, whatever it might have been, but the gesture itself, and I realized that it did not matter, that whatever was inside could not change what had already been decided, and I set it back where it was, unopened, not out of resentment but out of certainty, because some things do not need to be examined further once they have revealed their meaning. Life did not become perfect after that. It did not suddenly transform into something easier or lighter, but it became clearer, more grounded, and there is a kind of strength that comes from clarity, a steadiness that does not rely on other people's choices or approval. And as I stood in my kitchen that night, looking out at the quiet street, I understood that what I had done was not about cutting someone off in anger. It was about drawing a line in understanding, a line that protected what I had built, what I had worked for, and what I intended to keep, and in that understanding there was no doubt, no hesitation, only the quiet certainty that from this point forward, my life would be shaped by my decisions alone, and that was something no one else would ever have access to again.